Damn. Anyways.
Man, 2023 was the year ever. Barbie and Oppenheimer premiered in cinemas nationwide. The use of AI becomes more common than we thought. East Palestine happened. And this was the year you would have found BNSF locomotives in the province of Ontario on a daily basis. Crazy, right? Back then, I wish this was a foamer's fantasy. But this was, or is what CN's rail fans experienced back in 2023, and is technically still happening today. This is the BNSF Jeep epidemic of 2023.
Listen, mic check. If I go again, check me out. Check it out. Mic check. If I go again, check me out. Check it out.
To set the scene, let's jump back to 2021. CN's 4-axle fleet was in a weird dilemma. The last GMD1s were retired, and within the next year, they would start acquiring second-hand power from leasing agencies to the roster. Shameless plug goes here. The primary focus is in Eastern Canada, where the local power was predominantly made up of GP38s, GP40s, and GP9s, the latter of whom were well into their 60s, and you could probably tell they were worn out. While the GP38s and GP40s were still pretty good machines, they were in more smaller numbers. Even the new GMTXs only amounted to 13 units. Around that time though, BNSF units were creeping their way through Canada as foreign power, ranging from the regular GEVOs to more rare examples. This would be the result of horsepower hours. To keep it simple, a locomotive could be sent out to another railroad, and in return, said railroad would send out another locomotive to the other railroad, which was a pretty fair way for rail companies to borrow locomotives from each other. While most Class 1 railroads usually go for 6-axle locomotives in this situation, CN was desperate for 4 axles. Starting in June of 2023, CN would begin borrowing 4-axle locomotives from BNSF, which is unusual motive power to say the least. While BNSF had 4 axles like GP60s, B40s, and GP38s sporting liveries like Heritage 3 and 4, a majority of those were already serving across the system and were generally unavailable to lend out to Canada. BNSF instead gave them more exotic examples, which were locomotives that were, before, sitting in storage lines and haven't seen much service since the mid-2010s. And over the course of a few months, BNSF would send over more 4-axle locomotives to CN, being widespread across Ontario and Quebec, and even as far as Winnipeg and Vancouver. While I'm spotlighting 5 locomotives here, I'll mention a few that ended up elsewhere. Number 2316, the first one to make it into Canada. It started off as Frisco 461, built in November 1976. It became a part of BN until later gaining its BNSF colors. I only caught this 3 times around the summer of 2023, and was hoping to get it leading. Unfortunately, that wasn't the case. It was later reassigned out of Memphis allegedly, at least from what I heard. 2082, a BN Green Bean. It was built in May 1972 for the Burlington Northern, wearing its green Cascade colors all the way into modern day. This unit was assigned out of Vancouver, which is the case for a couple of other units which I couldn't find any information about. 2014, a bit of an interesting case for this one. It was built in September 1968 for Penn Central, later ending up on Conrail, then the Rio Grande, then Union Pacific, rebuilt by National Rail Equipment, and then sold to BNSF in 2006. 2262, another Frisco GP38, built in June 1973 and ending up on the BN and later BNSF, and pretty much assigned to Montreal during his time on CN. And number 2302. This is the same case as 2262. Another Frisco unit ended up on BN and then assigned out to Montreal, but it was sent away around August of 2023, returning to BNSF for storage, and is currently rotting away in East St. Louis as of July. Now then, with those covered, let's talk about the 5 locomotives that ended up in Ontario. 2317. A Frisco GP38-2 built in November 1976. It was originally sent out to Montreal throughout 2023, but within the next year, it was reassigned to the Toronto Power Pool. I didn't really see this locomotive at all until 2025, which you could find footage of it through that return vlog I made back in February. 2090. This locomotive, on the other hand, came from the Burlington Northern and was built in November of 1974, also sporting the iconic Heritage 1 livery. It would spend its entire leasing period in southern Ontario. I was fortunate enough to capture this locomotive a multitude of times, with varying degrees of success. During 2024, it was briefly fitted with temporary ditch lights hanging beside the regular ditches, as I caught this locomotive leading a local back in October. (2968). A more older EMD here, in the form of a GP39V, which were rebuilt GP35s. Originally built in August 1964 as Guelph Mobile in Ohio number 613, it lasted into service well into the 1990s when it was sold to Burlington Northern and later rebuilt into a GP39V, with the V allegedly standing for the type of electrical systems they were rebuilt with. If that's the case, information on these rebuilds is generally pretty limited from what I could find. Unfortunately, during its time with CN, it suffered a slight oopsie, when on January 17, 2024, 2968 would split the switches while marshalling cars at CN's Sarnia yard. The locomotive would vanish for 8 months before returning back into service with CN, which is still the case at the time of this recording, and it's the only one of these locomotives that I have not seen leading. (2926). Oh boy, now we're getting to the good ones. This locomotive's origins makes it the oldest of the 5, being built in 1963 originally for the Great Northern, and later rebuilt into a GP39E by Morrison Knutson in the early 90s. Maybe this unit actually fared out. I mean, given the fact that it's a BN locomotive, I'm surely hoping that it at least has some success. God damn it! Well, on June 19, 2024, 2926 was working on a belt pack industrial job when it struck a garbage truck at a crossing within Hamilton, Ontario. This resulted in 2926's front handrails being damaged, and the locomotive was stored in Toronto for a few months before being returned back to BNSF around December of last year. It has not returned to CN ever since, and given it's not a GP38, I doubt CN will ever need it. Finally, the King Jewel of the Geeps, 2098, the one everyone and their mother went out for. The Lean Green Bean, a raw BN locomotive built in November 1974, it's kept its original Burlington Northern identity, albeit with BNSF patchings. It was primarily assigned out of Brantford on the Hagersville local for the first few months of its leasing period, where it also regained its original BN logo thanks to some local hoggers. Aside from jumping across Ontario, usually trailing on different jobs, it's been the former magnet during its time in Eastern Canada, albeit spending most of its time either in storage or trailing behind CN slop. Thankfully, despite my terrible luck, I was fortunate enough to capture it leading technically on yard jobs during its time in London last year. these locomotives would last well into 2023 and into next year, with word going around that these locomotives would be returned back to said railroad by the end of the year. However, that would change once 2025 was a thing. On January 14th, number 2316 emerged from the States, now becoming CN 4959. It was confirmed that CN had begun purchasing their loaned Geeps. And throughout the rest of the year, CN would begin patching and rebuilding the beam-sniffing EMDs, with some having mixed results of patch jobs. You might be wondering, well, what about the Green Bean himself? The GOAT! The King! The almighty 2098! Well... oh no, if you think that's a bastardization, it truly became Canadian. Yeah, I'm dying on the inside too. And for those curious, here's a list of renumberings. As of today, some of the BNSF Geeps are still active on CN. From working local freight trains to switching out in rail yards, they've added a welcome splash of color to the mostly dull CN roster, with the only exceptions being 2090 and 2968 still maintaining their original liveries primarily untouched. Although, who's to say that the orange will soon be covered with the mediocre livery? All I can say is, get your photos while you still can, if you live in Canada.